He walked onto Jimmy Fallon's stage with a smile, but carried a secret he'd buried for 23 years. What began as a light interview turned into a moment so heavy the studio fell silent. 5 words escaped Keanu Reeves's lips, and Jimmy couldn't speak. What was the truth he had never dared to share until that night? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The applause was still fading when the air changed. It was subtle at first, the kind of shift you feel before a storm breaks. Jimmy Fallon's smile lingered frozen halfway between charm and habit as he looked across the desk at Keanu Reeves. The audience sensed it too. Something was different. Not dramatic, not loud, just heavy. The kind of weight that presses on the chest without warning. Keanu sat still, hands resting together, shoulders relaxed, the way they always were. He looked calm, almost peaceful, but his eyes told another story. They were darker than usual, fixed somewhere far beyond the bright studio lights, as if he were seeing a moment no one else in the room could see. The cameras kept rolling. The red lights blinked softly. Millions of viewers watched, unaware that they were seconds away from witnessing something that would change the tone of the night forever. Jimmy leaned forward slightly, preparing to move on to keep the rhythm of the show alive. This was the moment where laughter usually followed, where applause filled the space. Instead, silence settled in. Not awkward silence, intentional silence. The kind that demands attention. The kind that makes people stop breathing without realizing it. Keanu inhaled slowly. He did not rush. He did not glance at the crowd. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but steady, carrying a gravity that cut through the room more sharply than any raised tone ever could. Her name was Ava Reeves. 5 words, simple, unadorned, and yet they landed like a physical force. The studio did not react at first. No gasp, no murmur, just stillness. Jimmy's expression changed instantly. His eyebrows lifted, his mouth parted slightly, but nothing came out. He stared at Keanu frozen, as if his mind were struggling to catch up with what his heart already understood. The audience leaned forward as one. People who had been smiling seconds earlier now sat motionless, hands clasped together, eyes locked on the man across from Jimmy. No one checked their phone. No one shifted in their seat. The moment demanded everything from them, and they gave it willingly. Keanu did not look away. He did not flinch. He held the silence, letting it breathe, letting the truth settle into the room. 23 years of unspoken love and grief pressed into that single sentence. 23 years of answers never given, of interviews redirected, of personal pain carefully folded away and carried quietly. Jimmy swallowed hard. His voice was gone. The host, who had filled years of late-night television with humor, music, and energy, could not find a single word. His hands rested flat on the desk, unmoving. The cameras caught everything. The way his eyes glistened, the way his chest rose and fell faster than before. The studio audience felt it then. This was no longer an interview. This was not a story being told for entertainment. This was a door opening into something deeply human. Something raw, something sacred. Keanu's gaze remained calm, but there was a tenderness there that had not been visible before. Not the practiced humility fans knew so well, but something far more vulnerable, something that came from the deepest place a person can reach. A place shaped by love that never fades and loss that never fully leaves. Time stretched. Seconds felt like minutes. The silence grew louder than applause ever could. Somewhere in the crowd, someone covered their mouth. Another person reached for the hand beside them. No one knew the full story yet, but everyone understood one thing clearly. Whatever Keanu Reeves was about to share had been waiting a very long time to be spoken. The silence did not break. It deepened. Even the soft hum of the studio lights seemed louder than before. Jimmy blinked once slowly, as if grounding himself in the present. He had interviewed presidents, musicians, actors, people who had revealed scandals, triumphs, confessions, meant to shock. None of that prepared him for this. Not for the way those 5 words had changed the air, the weight of them pressing down on everyone in the room. Her name was Ava Reeves. Keanu remained still, breathing evenly, as if he had been rehearsing this moment not in words but in courage. His shoulders did not slump, his voice had not cracked, but there was a quiet finality in his tone that told the truth more clearly than tears ever could. This was not an impulse. This was a decision made long before the cameras turned on. The audience began to understand that they were witnessing the breaking of a vow Keanu had kept for more than 2 decades. A vow of silence, a promise to protect something fragile by keeping it hidden. The kind of promise a father makes when there is nothing left to protect but memory. Jimmy's lips moved, trying to form a question, any question, but his voice failed him. He nodded instead, a small, involuntary gesture, as if giving Keanu permission to continue. His eyes never left Keanu's face. They were wide now, unguarded, stripped of the performance that usually defined late-night television. Keanu glanced briefly toward the audience, then back to Jimmy. There was no drama in his posture, no search for sympathy. Only a quiet resolve, as if he had crossed an invisible line and could not go back. The cameras captured the smallest details, the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers pressed together, grounding himself in the present. For years, people had wondered why Keanu Reeves carried such a deep sadness beneath his kindness, why his generosity felt instinctive, almost urgent, why his humility seemed less like a choice and more like a necessity. In this moment, none of those questions needed answers anymore. They were dissolving into something far more important. Jimmy finally exhaled, a shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His voice came out barely above a whisper, rough around the edges, stripped of confidence. It sounded less like a host speaking and more like a man trying to keep himself together. The audience could see it now. The tears pooling in his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly against the desk. He did not try to hide it. There was no reason to. Everyone in the room was feeling the same thing, a sudden awareness of how fragile life truly is, how quickly joy and grief can exist in the same space. Keanu watched him with a gentleness that felt almost protective. There was no rush in him, no expectation. He allowed Jimmy the space to process what had just been said. He allowed the room to catch up. This was not a reveal meant to shock. It was a truth meant to be honored. Somewhere in the audience, a woman quietly wiped her eyes. A man lowered his head, staring at his clasped hands. Parents thought of children. Children thought of parents. People thought of names they had never spoken out loud, losses they had learned to carry in silence. The Tonight Show had never felt like this before. The familiar rhythm of jokes and applause was gone, replaced by something far more powerful. Presence, attention, shared humanity, the kind of connection that cannot be scripted or timed or rehearsed. Keanu's words lingered in the air, refusing to fade. 23 years of silence had been shattered, not with a shout, but with a whisper strong enough to stop time itself. And everyone in that studio understood one undeniable truth. This was only the beginning. The cameras kept rolling, but the world outside that studio no longer existed. This was not television anymore. This was a moment unfolding in real time, raw and unfiltered, with no safe distance for anyone watching. Jimmy finally lowered his gaze, pressing his lips together as if to keep himself from breaking completely. When he looked back up, his eyes were glassy, vulnerable, in a way his audience had rarely seen. Keanu did not look away. He did not retreat from the moment he had opened. Instead, he sat there grounded, accepting whatever came next. There was no regret in his expression. Only a quiet acceptance, as if speaking her name out loud had lifted a weight he had carried alone for far too long. The audience understood now that they were witnessing something irreversible. A line had been crossed. A silence that had protected and imprisoned at the same time had finally been broken. Whatever followed would no longer belong only to Keanu. It would belong to every parent who had loved and lost, every person who had learned to survive with an invisible ache. Jimmy opened his mouth again, searching for words, but none came. His role as host had dissolved completely. He was no longer guiding a conversation. He was standing at the edge of a truth too powerful to control. And in that suspended moment before the story was fully told, one thing became painfully clear. This confession would change everything. Backstage at 30 Rockefeller Plaza, the noise of the building felt distant, like it belonged to another world. Footsteps echoed down long corridors. Crew members passed by with clipboards and headsets, laughing softly, focused on timing and cues. Inside one small dressing room, however, time moved differently. Keanu Reeves sat alone on a simple couch, his back straight, his elbows resting lightly on his knees. In his right hand, he held a small silver locket. It was old, the surface worn smooth from years of being touched, opened and closed again in private moments no one ever witnessed. The chain draped loosely over his fingers. Inside, barely visible unless held close, was a tiny photograph. Not clear, not perfect, but precious beyond measure. It was the only image he carried with him everywhere, the one thing he never let go of. Keanu's eyes were fixed on it, unblinking. They were calm, but heavy. The kind of heaviness that comes from carrying something too important to share, too painful to explain. He had sat like this many times before interviews, before premieres, before long flights. But tonight was different. Tonight, the locket felt heavier than it ever had. He closed it slowly, his thumb lingering over the clasp. For years, this small object had stayed hidden beneath jackets and shirts, pressed close to his chest like a secret heartbeat. It had been his way of remembering without explaining, loving without speaking, protecting something fragile from a world that consumes everything it touches. A gentle knock broke the stillness. Keanu looked up as the door opened just a little. A makeup artist stepped inside, careful not to intrude too much. She had worked with countless celebrities, but something about Keanu always made people lower their voices around him. Not because he demanded it, but because his presence invited respect. She noticed immediately how still he was, the locket in his hand, the distant look in his eyes. "You okay, Mr. Reeves?" she asked softly. Keanu didn't answer right away. His gaze dropped back to the locket, his fingers tightening around it for just a moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, measured, almost reflective. "Sometimes," he said, "the truth just weighs more." The makeup artist paused, unsure what to say. She nodded gently, sensing this was not a moment for questions. She had no idea what he meant, but something in his tone told her this was not about nerves or exhaustion. This was about something far deeper. She gave him a small, understanding smile and stepped back out, closing the door quietly behind her. Alone again, Keanu exhaled slowly. He leaned back against the couch, staring up at the ceiling. For more than 2 decades, he had learned how to answer questions without answering them, how to smile without revealing too much, how to deflect with kindness. It had protected him. It had protected her. But tonight, sitting in that dressing room, something inside him shifted. He thought about the interviews he had done over the years, the same questions asked in different ways. What keeps you grounded? What motivates you? What gives you strength? He had always responded carefully, respectfully, without lying, but never fully telling the truth either. His fingers brushed the locket again, almost unconsciously. Tonight felt different, not because of the cameras, not because of the audience, but because he was tired of carrying this alone, tired of letting silence speak for him, tired of pretending that love ends just because a life never began the way it was supposed to. Keanu sat forward again, resting his elbows on his knees, locket clasped firmly in his hand. For the first time in 23 years, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that speaking her name might not break him. It might finally free him. Keanu stood and moved toward the mirror along the wall, the locket still closed in his palm. The reflection looking back at him was familiar, yet different tonight. Same black suit, same quiet posture, same calm expression the world had come to know. But behind his eyes was a resolve that had not been there before. Not defiance, not fear, acceptance. He rested one hand on the edge of the counter and opened the locket again just slightly enough to glimpse the tiny photograph inside. The image was faint edges softened by time, but he didn't need clarity. He never had. He knew every detail by heart. He had memorized it years ago, not with his eyes, but with his soul. For a long time, he had believed silence was protection, that by keeping her name unspoken, he was honoring something sacred. He had convinced himself that the world did not deserve to know, that explaining would cheapen the truth, that grief, when exposed, could be misunderstood, dissected, or turned into spectacle. And so, he had carried it quietly, interview after interview, year after year. But silence has a cost. Keanu felt it now more clearly than ever. The weight he mentioned earlier was not just sadness. It was the burden of being unseen in the most important part of his life, of answering questions about purpose while holding back the one truth that shaped everything else, of smiling through conversations that danced around the very center of who he had become. A knock sounded again, firmer this time. 5 minutes, Mr. Reeves, a stage assistant, called gently from the other side of the door. Keanu closed the locket and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, where it always rested directly over his heart. He straightened his coat, rolled his shoulders once, and took a deep breath. This was the moment he usually focused on the mechanics of the show, the lights, the applause, the rhythm of the questions. Tonight his mind went somewhere else entirely. He thought about all the moments he had almost spoken before. Interviews where the words rose to his lips and then retreated. Times when he felt her presence so strongly that keeping silent felt dishonest. He remembered the nights he sat alone after long filming days, holding the locket, wondering if saying her name out loud would somehow make the pain sharper. Instead, the pain had simply stayed. Keanu opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The sounds of the studio grew louder as he walked. Laughter, music, the familiar buzz of live television. Crew members nodded at him as he passed some, offering encouraging smiles. To them, this was just another show, another appearance by a beloved actor. None of them knew the decision he had already made. As he walked toward the stage entrance, Keanu felt an unexpected calm settle over him. Not relief, not excitement, clarity. For the first time in years, he was not preparing to perform a version of himself that avoided the truth. He was preparing to simply be present. He stopped briefly at the edge of the curtain, just out of sight of the audience. The applause from the opening segment washed over him, distant but powerful. He placed his hand over his jacket pocket, feeling the familiar shape of the locket beneath the fabric. Tonight, he would not force the moment. He would not announce anything. He would not make a spectacle. But if the question came, if the space opened naturally, he would no longer hide. The silence had protected him long enough. Keanu closed his eyes for a brief second, then opened them again, steady and resolved. When he stepped onto the stage, moments later, the audience saw the same Keanu Reeves they had always known. But behind the curtain, something had already changed forever. The hallway outside the stage entrance felt narrower than usual. Keanu paused there alone for a final moment, listening to the applause swell and fade. He imagined the millions of homes watching, unaware of the quiet decision already made. This was not about courage in front of cameras. It was about honesty with himself. He thought of the years he had spent choosing silence, not out of shame, but out of love. Love that did not know where to go once words failed. Love that learned to live quietly. Tonight, that love asked for something different. Not noise, not attention, just truth. A stagehand lifted a finger signaling his cue. Keanu nodded once. His breathing slowed. His shoulders relaxed. He did not rehearse lines or outcomes. Whatever happened would happen honestly. As he stepped closer to the curtain, he felt no fear, only a strange sense of alignment, as if every step of his life had led here. He touched the locket one last time through the fabric of his jacket. Not to say goodbye, but to say her name if the moment allowed. The curtain began to part, and with it years of silence waited on the other side. The set lights glowed warm and familiar, bathing the stage in a golden calm that usually signaled comfort and routine. This was Jimmy Fallon's world, a place built on rhythm, timing, laughter, and ease. Yet tonight, as he stood just off camera reviewing cue cards, something felt off. Not wrong, just unsettled. The kind of feeling that settles in the chest without explanation. Jimmy glanced toward the entrance where Keanu Reeves would soon walk out. He had interviewed Keanu before. Everyone loved Keanu. The crew loved him. The audience adored him. Interviews with him were usually gentle, thoughtful, even lighthearted. But earlier that day, Jimmy had woken up with a strange heaviness he could not shake. He had brushed it off as exhaustion, the long grind of production. Now, standing under the studio lights, he realized it was something else. Across the stage, the crew moved efficiently, adjusting microphones, checking camera angles, rehearsing transitions. The control room buzzed with quiet chatter. The rundown promised a fun segment, stories about motorcycles, a clip from the new film, a few laughs. Everything was planned. Everything was safe. Then Keanu stepped into view. There were no jokes exchanged with the stagehands, no playful wave, no small talk. He walked calmly to his mark, nodding politely, offering a soft smile that never quite reached his eyes. He sat down and waited, hands folded loosely, posture relaxed but alert. He did not fidget. He did not scan the room. He simply existed there, fully present. Several crew members noticed it at the same time. This was not nerves. This was not distraction. This was intention. One of the floor producers leaned toward another and whispered something quietly. The other nodded, eyes fixed on Keanu. In the control room, a producer tapped her pen against the desk, watching the monitor more closely than usual. The mood had shifted, and no one could quite name why. Jimmy felt it too. He walked toward his desk, smiling for the audience as the music swelled, but his instincts were alert now. The practiced ease he usually relied on felt thinner tonight. He glanced at Keanu again and noticed something that made his chest tighten slightly. Keanu was calm, not the calm of someone waiting patiently, the calm of someone who had already made peace with something difficult. The band finished the intro. Applause filled the studio. Jimmy waved, energized as always, but underneath the performance was a subtle restraint. He welcomed the audience, delivered the opening lines, hit his marks. Everything looked normal. Everything sounded right. But the energy beneath it all was different. When Jimmy introduced Keanu, the applause grew louder. Keanu stood acknowledging the crowd with his familiar humility. He waved gently, his smile, polite, warm, but brief. As he walked toward the desk, Jimmy noticed that Keanu did not look out into the audience the way he usually did. His focus was inward, as if he were carrying something fragile and did not want to drop it. They shook hands. Jimmy felt it immediately. There was a weight there. Not tension, not sadness alone. Something deeper, something unresolved. As Keanu sat down, Jimmy leaned in slightly, lowering his voice out of instinct. He did not ask if Keanu was okay. He did not joke. He simply met his eyes for a brief moment. What he saw there made him straighten in his chair. Keanu's eyes held a stillness that did not belong to entertainment. The cameras rolled. The audience smiled. The show moved forward. But beneath the surface, everyone on that set sensed the same thing. This was not going to be a normal interview. Something was coming. And no one was prepared for what it would be. As the interview began, Jimmy followed the script out of instinct, but his awareness never left Keanu. The opening questions were familiar, safe territory. Film projects, long shooting days, the physical demands of action scenes. Keanu answered calmly, politely, his voice steady and warm. He smiled when appropriate. He nodded at Jimmy's comments. To anyone watching casually, it looked like a perfectly normal conversation. But the crew felt it. Between questions, Keanu would pause just a fraction longer than usual. Not long enough to disrupt the flow, but long enough to be noticed by those trained to read rhythm. His hands rested together in his lap, fingers occasionally pressing against each other, then still again. He did not gesture much. He did not lean back. He remained grounded, almost anchored to the chair, as if leaving it even emotionally would cost him something. In the control room, the director watched closely. Camera 2 lingered on Keanu's face longer than planned, not because of instruction, but because something about his expression demanded attention. The lighting felt softer on him tonight, though nothing had been changed. The effect was subtle, but it made him seem more exposed, more human. Jimmy tried a light joke. The audience laughed. Keanu smiled, but it faded quickly like a reflection on water disturbed by a single ripple. Jimmy noticed. He adjusted, leaning less into humor, more into listening. He asked about motorcycles. Keanu responded with a brief story enough to satisfy the audience, but without the usual playful detail. During a commercial break, the applause faded and the lights shifted slightly. Jimmy turned toward Keanu, about to make a casual comment, then stopped. Keanu had gone quiet again. His gaze lowered, his right hand resting near the inside of his jacket, unmoving. Jimmy felt an urge to ask if everything was all right, but something held him back. Not fear, respect. This was not a moment to intrude. The floor manager counted down, cameras back on. Jimmy adjusted his posture, smiling again for the audience, but his questions shifted subtly. They became more open, less rehearsed. He asked about balance, about grounding, about how Keanu stayed connected after so many years in the spotlight. The words hung between them. In the audience, people leaned forward without realizing it. A woman in the front row clasped her hands together. Someone else stopped, smiling altogether, eyes fixed on Keanu. The laughter that usually filled the space between questions had softened, replaced by attentive silence. Keanu listened carefully to each word, his head slightly tilted, eyes focused on Jimmy with complete presence. When he answered, he chose his words slowly, deliberately, as if each one carried weight. He did not fill space unnecessarily. He did not deflect with humor. This was not avoidance. This was preparation. The crew felt it now more clearly than before. Something important was being carried into this conversation, something unscripted, something that could not be edited out without losing its power. A producer in the control room glanced at the clock, then back at the monitor, uncertain whether to be concerned or grateful. Jimmy's voice softened. His questions slowed. He was no longer thinking about beats or timing. He was listening for something he could not yet name. The unease he felt earlier had sharpened into awareness. Keanu's calm was not the calm of someone comfortable. It was the calm of someone ready. The studio lights continued to glow. The cameras continued to roll. The audience waited, sensing that the interview was slowly approaching, a moment it could not turn back from. Like still water before a storm, the set held its breath. And the storm was closer now than anyone realized. As the segment continued, the unease no longer felt abstract. It had a shape now, a direction. Jimmy felt it in the way his chest tightened when he looked at Keanu, in the way he instinctively slowed his pace, letting pauses linger instead of filling them. The usual safety net of late-night television had quietly disappeared. Keanu sat perfectly still, listening more than speaking. When he did answer, his voice carried a depth that made even simple sentences feel heavier. He was not performing, he was waiting. Waiting for the right question, waiting for the right opening, waiting for permission he did not need, but had honored for years. In the control room, conversation faded. Headsets went quiet. Eyes stayed locked on the monitors. No one signaled for jokes. No one rushed the timing. Something more important than pacing had taken over. Jimmy glanced down at his cue cards, then pushed them slightly aside. He felt it clearly now. This interview was no longer following the outline. It was following instinct. The audience felt it too. The room had grown quieter, more focused, as if everyone sensed they were standing at the edge of something irreversible. No one knew what was coming, only that it would matter. Keanu lifted his gaze, meeting Jimmy's eyes again. The moment was approaching, and once it arrived, there would be no way to turn back. Jimmy's voice lifted as the band finished, the intro energy filling the room the way it always did. He stood smiling, wide arms opening toward the stage entrance as he delivered the familiar words the audience loved to hear. The crowd responded instantly, applause, swelling cheers echoing off the walls. It was the sound of comfort, of routine, of a show unfolding exactly as expected. Ladies and gentlemen, Jimmy said, drawing out the moment, please welcome the one, the only, Keanu Reeves. Keanu stepped onto the stage to a standing ovation. He wore a tailored black suit, simple and understated, no flash, no excess. His hair fell naturally around his face, touched with gray that caught the studio lights. He raised one hand in a modest wave, offering a quiet smile that felt more grateful than celebratory. The audience roared louder, and he nodded slightly, acknowledging them without feeding the noise. As he crossed the stage, Jimmy watched him closely. Keanu's walk was relaxed, unhurried, as if he were stepping into a conversation rather than a performance. They met at center stage, shook hands, and for a brief second, Jimmy felt that same weight again. Subtle, but undeniable. Keanu's grip was steady, grounded. They sat. The opening minutes flowed easily. Jimmy leaned into humor, asking about the new film, the long shoots, the physical demands. Keanu answered politely, thoughtfully, his voice calm and warm. He smiled at the right moments. He laughed softly when Jimmy exaggerated a story or leaned into an impression. The audience laughed with them, the sound filling the room the way it was supposed to. Jimmy launched into a playful imitation of Keanu, learning motorcycle stunts, wobbling in his chair, arms flailing dramatically. The crowd burst into laughter. Keanu chuckled, shaking his head, eyes crinkling slightly at the corners. For a moment, it felt like any other late-night interview. Safe, familiar, enjoyable. But beneath the laughter, something else lingered. Between answers, Keanu's pauses stretched just a beat longer than usual. Not enough to interrupt, but enough to register. His hands rested loosely on his lap, fingers relaxed, then briefly pressing together before stilling again. His posture remained open, yet there was a subtle inwardness to him, as if part of his attention was focused elsewhere. Jimmy noticed, but did not comment. He adjusted naturally, letting Keanu speak at his own pace. He asked about preparation, about discipline, about staying grounded through years of fame. Keanu responded with honesty but restraint, offering thoughtful reflections without revealing too much. The first commercial break arrived. Applause filled the studio as the cameras cut away. The band played lightly. Stagehands moved in practiced efficiency. Jimmy turned slightly toward Keanu, about to make a casual comment, then stopped. Keanu had gone quiet. His gaze was lowered now, no longer scanning the room. His right hand had moved toward the inside of his jacket fingers, resting there, still. He did not fidget. He did not look anxious. He simply sat, breathing slowly, as if listening to something only he could hear. Jimmy hesitated. The urge to break the silence rose, then faded. He sensed this was not a moment to fill with chatter. He stayed still, respectful, letting the pause exist. When the cameras came back on, Keanu lifted his head again, offering a small nod as if signaling he was ready. The conversation resumed, but the tone had shifted slightly. The humor remained, but it was softer now, threaded with something more reflective. Jimmy asked another light question. Keanu answered, smiling briefly, then the smile faded as quickly as it came. Between commercial breaks, the pattern repeated. Laughter on camera, silence off camera. And each time Keanu's hand found his jacket pocket, each time his focus drifted inward, it became clearer that something inside him was slowly unraveling, not in chaos, in preparation. Whatever he was carrying had been waiting a long time, and it was getting closer to the surface. As the interview continued, Jimmy leaned into what he did best. He kept the energy light, guiding the conversation through familiar ground. He asked about action scenes that pushed physical limits, about long nights on set, about the discipline it took to keep returning to demanding roles year after year. Keanu answered with humility, crediting the crews, the stunt teams, the people behind the camera who made everything possible. The audience responded warmly, nodding, laughing at the right moments. Jimmy teased him gently about how calm he always seemed, even in the middle of chaos. Keanu smiled at that, a genuine but brief expression. He shrugged slightly and said something about finding peace in motion, about how riding motorcycles helped him clear his mind. The band chimed in with a playful riff, and the crowd laughed again. On the surface, everything felt exactly as planned, but Jimmy noticed something that didn't change. Keanu's eyes. Even when he smiled, there was a distance there, as if part of him was standing somewhere else entirely. Jimmy adjusted his posture, leaning forward more than usual, instinctively listening beyond the words. He asked a follow-up, expecting Keanu to elaborate, maybe tell a longer story. Instead, Keanu gave a concise answer and then fell quiet again. The silence did not feel uncomfortable. It felt deliberate. Another commercial break arrived. The applause rose, then faded. Crew members moved in smoothly, checking microphones, adjusting lighting. Jimmy turned toward Keanu again, this time offering a quiet comment about the audience's energy. Keanu nodded politely, but his attention was elsewhere. His fingers slipped once more into the inside pocket of his jacket, pressing lightly against something hidden beneath the fabric. Jimmy caught the movement this time. He said nothing, but something inside him tightened. It was not concern. It was recognition. The kind that comes when you realize someone is standing on the edge of a decision. When the cameras returned, Jimmy softened his tone without consciously planning to. His questions became less about spectacle and more about meaning. He asked Keanu what still excited him after all these years. What made a project worth saying yes to? What he looked for when choosing how to spend his time. Keanu listened carefully, eyes fixed on Jimmy with full attention. When he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, but carried a depth that had not been there earlier. He talked about connection, about stories that mattered, about choosing work that felt honest. The audience quieted, leaning in, sensing the shift, even if they couldn't explain it. Laughter became less frequent now, replaced by thoughtful murmurs, by nods of understanding. The interview was slowing down, settling into something more reflective. Jimmy allowed it. He did not rush to bring the humor back. He trusted the moment. Between sentences, Keanu paused again longer this time. His hand returned to his jacket pocket, fingers resting there still. He looked down briefly, then back up as if grounding himself. Jimmy held his gaze. There was an unspoken exchange happening now, not in words, but in awareness. Jimmy felt it clearly. This was no longer about promoting a film. This was about something personal, something carefully guarded. The audience felt it too. The room had grown quieter, more attentive. People shifted in their seats, not out of boredom, but anticipation. Something was forming beneath the surface of the conversation, something that could not be rehearsed or redirected. As Jimmy prepared to ask the next question, he hesitated for a fraction of a second. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he sensed that whatever came next might change the direction of the night entirely. Keanu sat calmly waiting, and inside him something long held was drawing closer to being spoken. By now, the rhythm of the interview had unmistakably changed. Jimmy could feel it in the way the audience no longer laughed as easily, in the way silence was no longer something to avoid, but something to respect. He shifted in his chair, glancing briefly at his cards, then setting them aside again. They suddenly felt unnecessary. Keanu sat with quiet composure, but his focus was sharper now, more inward. Between questions, his hand lingered at his jacket pocket, a moment longer than before, as if reassuring himself that what he carried was still there. His breathing remained steady, but his eyes revealed a gathering resolve. The audience watched closely, sensing they were being invited into something private. This was no longer a performance unfolding in neat segments. It was a conversation drifting toward its center, guided by instinct rather than structure. Jimmy leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice without realizing it. The tone had softened. The humor had stepped aside. What remained was attention, care, an unspoken agreement to follow wherever this moment was leading. Keanu lifted his gaze, meeting Jimmy's eyes again. There was no hesitation now, only readiness. The interview had begun as expected, but it was no longer heading where anyone had planned. Jimmy leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk, the way he did when he wanted to slow things down. His voice softened, not intentionally, but instinctively shaped by the mood that had settled over the room. The laughter had faded. The ease had thinned. What remained was attention. "You've accomplished so much," Jimmy said carefully, almost casually. "After everything you've done, all the success, all the years in this business, what keeps you grounded?" It was a question Keanu Reeves had heard countless times. Variations of it followed him through interviews, press tours, and quiet conversations. Backstage, usually he answered with grace. He spoke about gratitude, about staying present, about humanity. He never lied, he just never went all the way to the truth. Tonight, he didn't answer right away. The pause was immediate and noticeable. Not the brief hesitation of someone organizing thoughts, but a stillness that settled deeply into the room. Jimmy's eyebrows lifted slightly, his expression open, waiting. The audience shifted in their seats, sensing the shift. The silence stretched long enough that the hum of the lights felt louder. Keanu lowered his gaze. His hands, which had been resting calmly in his lap, moved slowly toward the inside of his jacket. There was no urgency in the motion, no nerves, just intention. His fingers slipped into the pocket he had touched so many times before, the one place his hand always found when the world grew quiet. He drew the object out slowly. A small silver locket caught the studio light as it rested in his palm. It was simple, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know its meaning. Keanu looked down at it, his thumb brushing over the worn surface, the tiny scratches earned over years of being carried close. The audience leaned forward. Jimmy's mouth parted slightly, but he didn't speak. He sensed that this was not his moment to guide or interrupt. This was something unfolding on its own. Keanu's breathing remained steady. He did not rush. He held the locket gently as if it might disappear if he wasn't careful. When he finally lifted his eyes, they did not scan the crowd. They returned to Jimmy, focused and calm, carrying a depth that made the room feel smaller. "Her name," Keanu said softly. The words hung in the air, incomplete, heavy with meaning. He paused again, just long enough for the weight of them to settle. Was Ava? The effect was immediate and profound. The studio fell completely silent. Not a single sound moved through the audience. No coughs, no whispers. Even the band members sat frozen, hands still on their instruments. The words did not echo. They sank. Jimmy froze. His practiced expression vanished, replaced by something raw and unguarded. His eyes widened slightly, then softened. His lips pressed together as if to keep himself steady. For the first time that night, he did not know what to say. Keanu held the locket in his open palm, not shielding it, not displaying it, simply allowing it to exist. His posture remained calm, but the truth in his voice changed the temperature of the room. This was not a dramatic reveal. This was a quiet truth, finally spoken aloud. 23 years of silence lived inside those 4 words. The audience did not yet know the full story, but they understood its gravity. People felt it instinctively, the way the body reacts to something sacred. A woman in the front row covered her mouth. A man further back lowered his head, eyes closed. Jimmy swallowed, his throat tightening. The question he had asked so casually had opened a door that could never be closed again. And Keanu Reeves, after decades of carrying this alone, had finally stepped through it. The silence did not break after Keanu spoke her name. It expanded. It pressed gently but firmly against every person in the studio, as if asking them to stay still, to listen, to honor what had just been offered. Jimmy remained frozen, his hands resting flat on the desk, his body angled toward Keanu in complete attention. The host was gone. What remained was a man witnessing something deeply personal. Keanu did not look away. He did not rush to explain. He allowed the name to exist on its own, free from context, free from justification. Ava. A name that had lived only in his heart for more than 2 decades was now suspended in the open air of a late-night studio, carried by silence rather than sound. Jimmy blinked slowly, his eyes glistening. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging not just the name, but the courage it took to say it. Around them, the audience leaned forward, drawn in by instinct. This was no longer curiosity. It was reverence. Keanu lowered his gaze again, looking at the locket in his palm. His thumb traced the edge once more, a familiar motion that steadied him. The object was small, but it seemed to carry the gravity of a life, of a love, of a truth that had shaped everything that followed. "I've never talked about her publicly," Keanu said quietly, his voice even, but layered with emotion that did not need volume to be felt. Not because I was ashamed, just because some things feel too important to explain. Jimmy's head dipped slightly, listening. He did not interrupt. He did not guide. He let Keanu speak in his own time. The audience remained completely silent. People forgot they were sitting in chairs, forgot they were part of a show. Parents thought of children. Children thought of names they had never heard spoken out loud. The space felt fragile now, as if any sudden sound might break something essential. Keanu looked up again, his eyes meeting Jimmy's with clarity and resolve. When you asked what keeps me grounded, he continued, I realized I didn't want to give the easy answer anymore. Jimmy's breath caught. His professional instincts urged him to respond, to ask a follow-up, to acknowledge the moment, but his humanity told him to wait. He stayed silent, his eyes never leaving Keanu's face. She's the reason, Keanu said simply. The words landed softly, but their impact rippled outward. This was not a declaration meant to shock. It was a confession shaped by love rather than loss. Ava was not being introduced as tragedy. She was being introduced as presence. Jimmy's hands trembled slightly as he shifted in his seat. His voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. Your daughter. It was not a question meant to probe. It was an invitation. Keanu nodded once. Yes. The room seemed to inhale together. In that moment, the question that had begun as casual curiosity revealed itself for what it truly was. A doorway, a turning point, a moment where entertainment gave way to truth, where a late-night interview transformed into something timeless. Keanu Reeves had carried this answer for decades, and now that it had been spoken, nothing in that studio would ever feel the same again. The word daughter seemed to echo without sound. Jimmy leaned back slightly, one hand rising to his chest, before he realized he was doing it. His eyes never left Keanu. The host, who always knew how to move a moment forward, was suddenly suspended inside it. Keanu nodded again, slow and deliberate, as if confirming something to himself as much as to anyone else. He closed the locket gently and held it in his palm for a moment longer, grounding himself in its weight. Then he lowered his hand to his lap, keeping the locket visible, no longer hidden. She was stillborn, Keanu said quietly. No dramatic emphasis, no pause for reaction, just truth spoken plainly. 1999. A collective breath moved through the room. Someone in the audience exhaled sharply before covering their mouth. Another person reached for the hand beside them. Jimmy's face shifted completely now, the last traces of television composure dissolving. His eyes filled, and he did not look away when the tears came. Keanu's voice remained steady, but there was a depth to it that made every word feel earned. For a long time, I thought keeping her name to myself was how I honored her, like saying it out loud might somehow make it smaller. He shook his head gently, but carrying something alone doesn't make it lighter. Jimmy swallowed hard. His lips parted, then pressed together again. He nodded slowly, silently, giving Keanu space. The audience followed his lead. No one rushed the moment. No one wanted to. Keanu looked out briefly toward the crowd, not searching for sympathy, but acknowledging their presence. She never took a breath, he said, but she changed everything about who I am. The words settled deep. The question that had begun as a familiar prompt had now revealed its true cost. What keeps you grounded was no longer a line from an interview. It was a doorway into a life shaped by love that never had the chance to grow old. Jimmy finally spoke, his voice breaking, despite his effort to steady it. I thank you for trusting us with that. Keanu met his eyes and nodded once. The truth was out now, and there was no turning back. The studio did not react the way audiences usually do. There was no audible gasp, no murmur of surprise, no instinctive response at all. It was as if the room itself had forgotten how to move. The applause signs stayed dark. The band members remained frozen in their seats. Even the cameras seemed to glide more slowly, as if respecting the gravity of what had just been said. Jimmy's face went completely still, not shocked, not confused, empty, as though every prepared response, every practiced instinct had been wiped clean in an instant. His eyes were locked on Keanu, unblinking, his mouth slightly open, but incapable of forming sound. For the first time in his career, he was not hosting. He was witnessing. The camera eased closer, almost imperceptibly, framing Keanu's face in a tight shot. No dramatic movement, no sharp cut, just a gentle narrowing of focus, as if the world itself was leaning in. "She was stillborn," Keanu said again, his voice steady, grounded, unshaken. 1999. The words were simple, factual, delivered without embellishment. Yet they carried a force that pressed down on every person in the room. Keanu did not look away. He did not swallow hard or clear his throat. He had lived with these words for too long to fear them now. "Her mother and I," he continued, pausing briefly, not from hesitation, but from care. "We never got to hold her." That was when the stillness deepened. A woman in the third row brought her hand to her chest, fingers curling into the fabric of her shirt as if to steady herself. Her eyes filled instantly. A man a few seats away lowered his head, wiping at his face with the back of his hand, his shoulders tightening as emotion overtook him. Someone else pressed their lips together, fighting tears. No one shifted in their seat. No one looked away. Jimmy's hands rested motionless on the desk. The familiar desk that had seen jokes, games, laughter, applause. It felt like a different object now. He stared at Keanu, his eyes glossy, his breathing shallow. The host, who always found humor, always found momentum, was completely undone. Keanu remained composed, but not distant. There was a presence in him that filled the room, a quiet strength, shaped by years of grief, transformed into something steady. His eyes moved briefly across the audience, acknowledging them without asking anything in return. He was not looking for sympathy. He was sharing truth. "I've carried her with me every day," he said softly, "even when no one knew her name." The words landed gently, but their impact rippled outward. People in the audience thought of moments they had never spoken about, losses they had hidden, names they had kept locked inside their hearts. The room was no longer filled with strangers. It had become a shared space of recognition. Jimmy finally blinked. His throat tightened visibly as he swallowed. He leaned forward slightly, as if drawn closer by something he could not resist. His eyes never left Keanu's face. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was necessary. This was not an interview anymore. This was a moment suspended in time where grief was not a spectacle, but a truth honored by stillness. And the world watching from millions of screens had gone just as quiet. The stillness spread beyond the audience and into the control room. Producers who normally tracked time codes and upcoming cues sat frozen in their chairs, eyes fixed on the monitors. No one reached for a headset. No one whispered instructions. The usual urgency of live television had vanished, replaced by something heavier and far more fragile. Keanu sat with the same quiet composure, his posture unchanged, his hands resting calmly in his lap. But there was a subtle shift in him now. Not a release, not relief, but openness. A door, long kept closed, had been opened, and the air moving through it carried memories no one else could see. For a long time, Keanu continued, his voice steady. "I didn't know how to talk about her without feeling like I was breaking something." Jimmy listened without moving, his eyes shining openly now. He did not wipe them. He did not look away. The cameras captured his face in raw honesty, the practiced polish of television stripped away. His lips trembled slightly as he took a careful breath. Keanu's gaze drifted briefly toward the floor, then lifted again. "People think grief is loud," he said, "that it looks like tears or anger or collapse, but most of the time it's quiet. It sits with you. It walks with you. It shapes the way you see everything." The audience absorbed every word. No one shifted, no one coughed. It was as if the room itself understood that any movement might shatter the moment. Keanu's voice did not waver, but it carried a depth that made each sentence feel measured, intentional. "She taught me something," he said, "that love doesn't need time to be real. It just needs truth. Jimmy's head dipped slightly, a slow nod of recognition. His hands tightened together, on the desk knuckles whitening. He was no longer thinking about viewers or segments or the clock. He was thinking about the weight of what Keanu had carried alone for so long. A woman in the audience pressed her fingers to her lips, tears streaming freely now. A man 2 rows back stared straight ahead, eyes glassy, jaw clenched, as if holding himself together by sheer will. Somewhere else, a couple held hands, their fingers intertwined tightly. Keanu paused, allowing the silence to do its work. He did not rush to fill it. He trusted it. "When I look at my life now," he said, "everything traces back to her. The choices I make, the way I treat people, the reason I try to be present even when it's hard." Jimmy inhaled sharply, then exhaled the sound barely audible but unmistakable. He leaned back slightly, one hand rising to his face, before stopping halfway, as if unsure whether to shield himself or stay fully open. The camera remained close on Keanu, capturing the calm in his expression, the quiet strength behind his words. There was no dramatics, no attempt to amplify emotion. The power came from restraint, from honesty, from years of lived experience. For the first time, the audience truly understood. This was not a confession made for attention. This was a truth finally given permission to exist in the open. And as Keanu spoke, the stillness in the room was no longer just silence. It was respect. The silence that followed was no longer heavy with shock. It had shifted into something deeper, something reverent. It was the silence people fall into when they realize they are sharing a moment that cannot be repeated or recreated. Jimmy sat back in his chair, his eyes still fixed on Keanu, his expression openly undone. He was no longer trying to manage his emotions. He let them be seen. Keanu remained steady, but the room could feel the years behind his words. Not just the loss itself, but the long aftermath. The birthdays that were never celebrated, the milestones that existed only in imagination, the quiet moments when grief surfaced without warning and then settled back into place. "I didn't know how to be a father without a child. I could hold," Keanu said softly, "but I learned that love doesn't disappear just because there's no one else who can see it." Jimmy's chest rose sharply as he took in a breath. He pressed his lips together, nodding slowly, absorbing every word. The audience mirrored him, heads bowed slightly, eyes locked forward, bodies still. Keanu's gaze drifted briefly across the room. He was not scanning for reactions. He was acknowledging presence. "She changed the way I understand pain," he continued, "and she changed the way I understand kindness. Because when you've felt that kind of loss, you know how fragile everyone is." A man near the aisle wiped his eyes again, shoulders shaking now. A woman a few rows up pressed her hand against her heart, her breathing uneven. No one looked away. No one wanted to miss a single word. Jimmy finally spoke, his voice barely holding together. "Keanu, I don't know how you sit here and say this with such calm." Keanu met his eyes gently. "Because I've had time," he said, "and because I've learned that carrying love is lighter than carrying silence." The words settled over the room like a quiet truth people had been waiting to hear. Jimmy nodded, tears finally slipping free, tracing down his face without apology. The cameras did not cut away. In that moment, The Tonight Show was no longer a stage. It was a space where grief was not hidden, where love was not diminished by loss, and where one man's courage to speak turned stillness into understanding. Jimmy's voice came out barely above a whisper, the words fragile but honest. "How do you live after something like that?" He did not dress the question in humor or distance. He asked it the way someone asks when they are no longer speaking as a host, but as a human being, trying to understand how another person keeps breathing after the unimaginable. Keanu looked up slowly. His eyes met Jimmy's, steady and clear. There was no hesitation in him now, no searching for the right phrasing. He had lived with this answer long enough to know it by heart. "You don't carry the loss, Jimmy," he said gently. "You carry the love." The sentence landed softly, but it traveled far. It moved through the room and into people's chests, settling there with a quiet certainty. Jimmy inhaled sharply as if the words had found something inside him and pressed on it. He nodded once, slowly absorbing the meaning rather than responding to the sound. Keanu continued, his voice calm, grounded, shaped by years of reflection. Loss feels heavy because we think that's what we're supposed to hold, the pain, the absence. But love doesn't disappear, it doesn't go anywhere. It just changes how it shows up. The audience leaned in without realizing it. The room felt closer now, more intimate, as if the walls had moved inward to hold the moment. Keanu's hands rested loosely together, his posture relaxed, but purposeful. He was not reliving the past. He was explaining how he had learned to live alongside it. "I never stopped being her father," he said quietly. "That didn't end because she wasn't here. It became something different, something private, something constant." Jimmy swallowed, his eyes glossy, his voice caught somewhere behind his chest. He did not interrupt. He did not guide. He allowed Keanu the space to finish the thought in his own time. For a long time, Keanu said, "I thought grief was the price you pay for love. That if it hurt enough, it meant the love was real. But that wasn't fair to either of us." He paused, letting the words breathe. "Ava didn't need me to suffer to prove I loved her. She needed me to live." The audience felt the shift immediately. This was no longer about surviving tragedy. This was about transforming it. About choosing to let love remain active instead of letting grief become the only voice. Keanu spoke of how her memory followed him into everything he did, into the roles he chose, into the way he treated people when no one was watching, into small decisions that never made headlines but mattered deeply. "Every time I try to be kind," he said, "every time I slow down for someone, every time I choose patience over anger, that's her with me." Jimmy nodded again, tears finally slipping free, now tracing down his face without resistance. He did not wipe them away. He did not apologize. He stayed present. "Death doesn't end love," Keanu said, his voice steady, unwavering. "It just changes how it shows up." The room held the words in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because nothing needed to be added. And for the first time since the interview began, the stillness felt lighter, not because the pain had disappeared, but because love had been given room to breathe. Jimmy leaned back slightly in his chair, one hand resting against the edge of the desk as if to steady himself. His eyes never left Keanu. "That sounds impossible," he said softly, "to carry love without being crushed by what's missing." Keanu listened carefully, nodding once. "It feels impossible at first," he replied, "because when you lose someone that way, the absence is loud. It fills every space. You wake up and it's there. You go to sleep and it's there. And for a long time, that absence feels like the only thing left." He paused, choosing his words with care. "But slowly, if you let it, love starts to speak louder than the absence." The audience remained utterly still. Every sentence felt like it was being offered directly to someone who needed it. Keanu's voice never rose, never wavered. Its strength came from certainty, from years of learning what grief could become if it was not allowed to harden. "I realized something over time," he continued. "If I spent my life focused on what I lost, then Ava's impact would end there, with loss. But if I let her change how I loved the world, then she was still here, still working through me." Jimmy's eyes closed briefly, just a second, as if the weight of that truth had become too much to hold all at once. When he opened them again, they were wet, unguarded. "So everything you do now," he began, "comes from that place," Keanu finished gently. "Every role I take, I ask myself if it matters, not if it's successful, not if it's impressive, but if it's honest, if it connects, if it leaves something good behind." He spoke about moments on set when someone was struggling and how he would feel an instinct to stop, to listen, to offer kindness without needing recognition. "People think it's about being nice," he said. "It's not. It's about remembering how much pain people carry quietly. Because I carry mine quietly too." The audience absorbed this in silence. A few heads nodded, a few shoulders shook, as tears were released without restraint. No one looked embarrassed. No one felt alone. I used to think being strong meant not letting anyone see that part of me, Keanu said. But strength isn't silence. Strength is letting love stay open even when you know how much it can hurt. Jimmy leaned forward again, elbows on the desk, now fully engaged. And you never felt like moving forward meant leaving her behind, he asked, his voice careful, respectful. Keanu shook his head slowly. No, moving forward was how I carried her with me. Staying stuck would have been the real loss. He let that thought settle before adding quietly, love doesn't ask us to stop living. It asks us to live differently. The words moved through the room like a quiet current, touching places no one could see. The conversation had gone far beyond the question that started it. It had become a shared understanding. Keanu Reeves was not describing how to survive grief. He was describing how to let love outlive it. Jimmy sat in silence for a long moment, his hands folded together, now his posture no longer that of a host guiding a segment, but of a listener holding something fragile. When you say you're still her father, he said. Finally, voice low and careful, what does that look like after all these years? Keanu's expression softened, not into sadness, but into something gentler. It looks like responsibility, he said. It looks like choosing how I show up in the world. He paused, letting the thought settle. Being her father means I carry her values forward. Even though she never spoke, she taught me what matters. He spoke of quiet moments, of standing in line somewhere ordinary and noticing someone struggling, of slowing down when the world demanded speed, of choosing compassion even when no one would ever know. Those moments feel like conversations, he said, not with words, with presence. Jimmy nodded slowly, his breathing uneven now. So she's with you, he said, not as a question but as recognition. Yes, Keanu answered without hesitation. Every day, not as pain, as guidance. The audience felt the shift. This was no longer a story rooted in tragedy. It was a story rooted in continuity, in love that had not ended, only changed form. Tears still flowed, but they were different now, softer, mixed with understanding. For a long time, Keanu continued, I thought the way to honor her was to stay broken, to stay quiet. But that wasn't love. That was fear. He looked at Jimmy steadily. Love is active. Love moves. Love gives. Jimmy pressed his lips together, nodding as a tear slid down his cheek. He did not wipe it away. I think a lot of people watching right now are realizing something about their own lives, he said. Keanu nodded. I hope so, he replied, because loss doesn't make us smaller. It makes us more aware, more capable of empathy. If we let it. He leaned forward slightly now, voice still calm but more present than ever. I don't wake up thinking about what I lost. I wake up thinking about how I can live in a way that keeps love alive. The room remained silent, but it was no longer heavy. It felt held, like everyone inside it had been given permission to breathe a little deeper. Jimmy exhaled slowly, shaking his head in quiet disbelief. That's extraordinary, he said, barely audible. Keanu offered a small, humble nod. It's just love, he said. And in that moment, love felt like the strongest thing in the room. The commercial break arrived quietly, almost reluctantly. The studio lights dimmed just a fraction, the band lowered their instruments, and the audience exhaled as one, as if they had all been holding their breath together. No one clapped right away. No one moved. The weight of what had just been shared lingered in the air, fragile and sacred. Jimmy stayed seated. For a moment he stared down at the desk in front of him, his hands resting flat against the smooth surface. His shoulders rose and fell unevenly as he tried to steady his breathing. The tears had stopped, but the emotion had not. It sat heavy in his chest, pressing outward, asking for space. Keanu turned slightly toward him, not speaking, not intruding. He simply waited. The cameras were off now. The audience could not hear them. This was not a moment meant for television. This was something else entirely. Jimmy finally looked up. His eyes met Keanu's, and whatever composure he had left slipped away. He reached out without thinking, his hand crossing the small distance between them. His fingers wrapped around Keanu's wrist, tentative at first, then firmer as if grounding himself in the connection. "We lost a baby too," Jimmy said, his voice breaking the silence. It came out rough, uneven, stripped of all performance. "Last year," Keanu's hand stilled beneath his. He did not pull away. "A miscarriage," Jimmy continued, swallowing hard. 12 weeks. Nancy and we never really talked about it. I didn't know how. I thought if I stayed quiet, if I acted like it didn't happen, maybe it would hurt less." His voice faltered completely now. He shook his head slowly, eyes shining. "It didn't." Keanu turned fully toward him then. He did not rush to respond. He did not offer platitudes or reassurances shaped by distance. Instead, he squeezed Jimmy's hand, gently but firmly, a steady pressure that carried understanding rather than sympathy. "You can talk about it," Keanu said softly. "You should." Jimmy's breath caught. His fingers tightened reflexively around Keanu's hand, as if the permission he had just been given was something physical, something he might lose if he let go. "Their lives matter," Keanu continued. "No matter how short, no matter how early. Love doesn't measure itself in time." Jimmy closed his eyes, briefly nodding as tears spilled again unchecked. This time they felt different. Not overwhelming, not sharp. They felt like release. "I didn't even know if it was a boy or a girl," Jimmy whispered. "We never found out." Keanu shook his head gently. "Doesn't change anything," he said. "You loved them. That's what makes it real." The noise of the studio seemed to fade completely. Crew members nearby pretended not to look, giving them space. The audience remained silent, sensing instinctively that this was not a break meant to be filled with chatter. Two men sat there, hands clasped, neither speaking for a moment. No titles, no cameras, no expectations. Just two fathers sharing a language only loss can teach. In that quiet space, something shifted. Jimmy was no longer carrying his grief alone, and Keanu was no longer the only one in the room who understood what it meant to love someone the world never got to meet. Jimmy kept his hand where it was, as if letting go might cause the moment to vanish. His breathing slowly began to steady, but his eyes stayed wet, red at the edges. He looked down briefly, then back up at Keanu, almost embarrassed by his vulnerability, almost relieved by it. "I thought my job was to be strong," Jimmy said quietly. "For Nancy, for everyone. I thought if I didn't bring it up, if I didn't say anything, then maybe she wouldn't have to carry it either." Keanu listened without interrupting, his expression calm and open. He had heard this before, not just from others, but from himself years earlier. The instinct to protect by silence. The belief that pain spoken aloud somehow grows sharper. "But silence doesn't protect," Keanu said gently. "It isolates." Jimmy nodded, swallowing hard. "I see that now," he said. "I thought I was sparing her. What I was really doing was leaving her alone with it." Keanu's grip tightened slightly, not forceful, just present. "Grief shared doesn't double," he said. "It divides. It makes room to breathe." Jimmy exhaled shakily, the words landing somewhere deep. Around them, the studio felt different now. The usual urgency of commercial breaks, of reset cues and countdowns had disappeared. No one rushed them, no one interrupted. Everyone seemed to understand that whatever timing was lost could never matter as much as what was happening here. "I didn't know how to say it," Jimmy admitted. "I didn't know what words were allowed. It felt like, because the baby was never born, maybe it didn't count." Keanu shook his head immediately. "That's not how love works," he said. "Love doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't need milestones or proof. If you felt it, it was real." Jimmy pressed his lips together, nodding again and again, as if each nod confirmed something he had been afraid to believe. "I think I needed to hear that," he said. "I think a lot of people do." Keanu glanced briefly toward the darkened cameras, then back to Jimmy. "They will," he said, "whether tonight or someday. Because this kind of pain is more common than people admit. We just don't talk about it." Jimmy let out a quiet, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "I talk for a living," he said, "and I couldn't talk about this." Keanu offered a small, understanding smile. Some truths are heavier than words, he said, until they aren't. There was a pause then, not empty, reflective. Jimmy finally released Keanu's hand, resting his own on the desk again, but the connection remained. It lingered in the space between them, unspoken but solid. I don't want to hide it anymore, Jimmy said. I don't want Nancy to feel like it never mattered. Keanu nodded slowly. It mattered, he said, and it still does. The stage manager raised a hand gently from across the room, signaling that they had seconds before returning live. Jimmy glanced over, then back at Keanu. His eyes were steadier now, clearer, still emotional, but no longer lost. Thank you, Jimmy said simply. Keanu inclined his head. Anytime. As the countdown began, both men straightened in their chairs. The lights brightened again, the band prepared to play. But something fundamental had changed. They were about to return to television. Yet neither of them would return as the same person who had gone to commercial. The countdown echoed softly in the background, but neither man moved right away. Jimmy adjusted his jacket, wiping his face once with the back of his hand, then stopped himself. He took a slow breath, grounding himself the way Keanu had done earlier. When he looked back up, there was still emotion in his eyes, but there was clarity too. I don't think I've ever said this out loud, Jimmy admitted, voice low. Not like this, not to anyone outside my family. He paused, then added, It feels different now. Lighter. Keanu nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. That's what happens when truth has somewhere to go, he said. It stops circling inside you. Jimmy gave a small, grateful smile. I thought tonight was about interviewing you, he said. I didn't realize it was going to give me something back. Keanu met his gaze. That's how these moments work, he replied. They show up disguised as something else. The studio lights brightened again as they prepared to go live. The band shifted in their seats. Crew members took their positions. The world of television resumed its motion, but the space between the two men felt untouched by it. Jimmy rested both hands on the desk, now steady. When we go back, he said quietly, I don't know what I'm going to say. Keanu offered a calm, reassuring look. You don't have to say anything you're not ready to, he said. Just be present. That's enough. Jimmy nodded. The tension he had carried for months felt less tight, less sharp. He wasn't healed. He knew that, but he wasn't alone anymore either. The signal came. Cameras back on. Applause signs lit up. As the audience welcomed them back, Jimmy glanced once more at Keanu, a look of gratitude passing silently between them. Not gratitude for the interview, gratitude for the connection. Two fathers sat side by side again, not defined by fame or profession, but by love that had survived loss. And that quiet understanding would stay with them long after the lights went dark. When the cameras came back on, the shift was immediate. The lights felt the same. The set looked unchanged, but the energy in the room was entirely different. The applause that welcomed them back was softer, restrained, almost careful, as if the audience sensed they were stepping into something fragile. Jimmy sat straighter in his chair, but the familiar ease in his posture was gone. What remained was honesty. He turned toward Keanu, and this time there was no cue card in his hand. His voice, when he spoke, cracked before he could steady it. What would you say, Jimmy asked, pausing to collect himself, to other parents who've lost children? The question hung in the air, heavy and exposed. It was no longer theoretical. It was personal. Not just for Jimmy, but for the audience, the crew, and everyone watching at home who had felt a similar absence and never known where to place it. Keanu did not hesitate. He leaned forward slightly, grounding himself in the moment, his eyes calm but intent. I would tell them this, he said gently. Your love is real. The room went completely still again, but this time it was a different stillness. Not shock, recognition. Even if the world never saw your child, Keanu continued, they lived in you. They changed you. They mattered. Jimmy nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on Keanu's face. His lips trembled, but he did not interrupt. He didn't need to. Every word was landing exactly where it needed to. Grief shared, Keanu said, choosing his words with care, is grief divided. It becomes lighter when it's allowed to exist outside of you. He paused briefly, then added, but love shared, love multiplies. The words moved through the room like a quiet wave. A camera operator near the edge of the set lowered his head, wiping his eyes quickly before looking back through the lens. In the control room, producers sat motionless, hands folded, no one calling out times or transitions. The usual machinery of television had stopped entirely. Keanu's voice remained steady, but it carried warmth now, something almost reassuring. We're taught to be quiet about loss, he said, to move on, to act like time erases love. It doesn't. Time just teaches us how to carry it. Jimmy's shoulders rose and fell with a slow breath. Tears streamed freely now, and he made no attempt to hide them. He leaned back slightly, shaking his head in disbelief, not at the pain, but at the clarity of what was being said. Keanu looked out toward the audience for the first time since the cameras returned. Not scanning, acknowledging. If you're watching this and you've lost a child, he said, please know this. You're not alone, and you're not broken for still loving them. A woman in the front row pressed her hand against her mouth, her shoulders shaking as she cried openly. A man nearby stared straight ahead, eyes glassy, his jaw clenched as if holding himself together with everything he had. This isn't something you get over, Keanu continued. It's something you grow around, and love is what does the growing. Jimmy wiped his face once, then let his hand fall back to the desk. His voice was barely audible when he spoke again. Thank you, he said, not as a host, as a father, as a human being. Keanu nodded quietly. In that moment, The Tonight Show was no longer just a broadcast. It was a space where truth was allowed to exist, and everyone in the room understood they were witnessing something far more lasting than television. The room did not rush forward after Keanu finished speaking. It stayed with him, suspended in the quiet he had created. Jimmy sat motionless for a moment, his hands resting flat on the desk, his breathing slow and uneven. When he finally looked up again, his eyes were red, but there was a steadiness there that had not existed before the break. That's incredibly powerful, Jimmy said, his voice still rough but more grounded now. I think a lot of people needed to hear that tonight. Keanu nodded once. I hope so, he replied, because this kind of love doesn't go away just because we stop talking about it. Around them, the crew remained unusually still. No one adjusted equipment, no one signaled for a transition. The band sat quietly, instruments untouched. Even the audience seemed to sense that applause would feel wrong here, like interrupting a conversation that was still unfolding. Jimmy leaned forward again, elbows on the desk, no longer hiding his emotion. There's this pressure, he said slowly, to move on, to be okay. And if you're not, people don't always know what to do with that. Keanu listened carefully, then answered without hesitation. That pressure comes from fear, he said. People are afraid of sitting with pain, especially pain they can't fix, but presence matters more than solutions. He spoke calmly, but every word felt deliberate. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for someone is to let them say their child's name, to let them remember out loud. Silence can feel respectful, but it can also feel like erasure. Jimmy nodded, visibly affected. That's exactly it, he said. It's like you don't want to make anyone uncomfortable, so you carry it quietly. And quietly can turn into lonely, Keanu replied. The simplicity of the statement made it hit harder. Jimmy exhaled, leaning back in his chair, staring up for a moment before returning his gaze to Keanu. I don't think this is just about parents, he said. I think it's about anyone who's lost someone and didn't know where to put the love that was left. Keanu's expression softened. Yes, he said. Love doesn't disappear when someone does. It looks for somewhere to go. A few people in the audience nodded openly, now tears still streaming. The energy in the room had shifted from grief to connection, from pain to understanding. This was no longer a moment of shock. It was a moment of shared truth. Jimmy placed one hand over his heart briefly, then lowered it back to the desk. "I'm really grateful you shared this," he said. "Not just for me, for everyone." Keanu inclined his head humbly. "It was time," he said. The cameras continued to roll, but no one was thinking about viewership or ratings anymore. The room had changed. The conversation had crossed into something rare. Television had stepped aside, and what remained was something honest, human, and quietly transformative. The room stayed quiet as Keanu continued, but the silence felt different now. It no longer carried shock or sorrow alone. It carried direction. Jimmy sat back, listening closely as Keanu's words shifted from memory to meaning, from grief to purpose. For a long time, Keanu said, his voice steady, "I thought my work was about surviving, paying bills, staying busy, keeping moving." He paused briefly, eyes lowering, then lifting again. "After Ava, that changed." Jimmy nodded slowly, inviting him to continue. "I started asking different questions," Keanu said. "Not about success, not about recognition, but about impact." His hands rested calmly on his knees, posture relaxed but intent. Does this role help someone feel less alone? Does this story matter beyond the screen? Does this moment leave something good behind? The audience leaned in, sensing the shift from reflection to revelation. Keanu explained how after Ava he could no longer separate his work from his values. Projects that once seemed exciting now felt hollow if they didn't serve a deeper purpose. "I didn't want to spend my time pretending pain doesn't exist," he said. "I wanted to be part of something honest." Jimmy's eyes remained fixed on him, his expression open, moved. "That's when I realized," Keanu continued, "that Ava wasn't just part of my past. She was shaping my future." He spoke calmly, without sentimentality, but the weight of the truth was unmistakable. "Every choice I made carried her with it." He described moments on set where he would slow down, noticing the people behind the scenes. The crew members no one applauded, the assistants who worked quietly, the extras who never spoke on camera. "I saw them differently," he said, "because loss teaches you how invisible pain can be." Keanu shared how he began supporting causes quietly at first, without names or press. Families who had lost infants, parents navigating grief without guidance, research groups struggling for funding to understand stillbirth and prevent it. "I didn't do it to fix what couldn't be fixed," he said. "I did it so fewer people would have to stand where I stood." Jimmy leaned forward slightly, and that became the foundation, he said. Keanu nodded. "Yes, eventually." He explained that the AVA Foundation didn't begin as an announcement or a plan. It began as letters, messages from parents who had written to him over the years, sharing stories of loss they had never spoken about publicly. They didn't want answers, he said. They wanted acknowledgement. "That's when I understood something," Keanu continued. "Silence can protect, but it can also isolate." Ava's story didn't need to stay hidden anymore. The audience remained silent, fully present. "So we built something," Keanu said, "not in her absence, but in her name." He spoke about the Foundation's mission: support for grieving families, counseling resources, research into preventing stillbirth, education that replaced shame with understanding. It wasn't about charity, he said, it was about connection. Jimmy swallowed, visibly moved. "That's incredible," he said quietly. Keanu shook his head gently. "It's necessary," he replied. He paused, then added softly, "Her story didn't end with silence." The words hung in the air, steady and certain. "It began with it." Jimmy took a slow breath, absorbing the scope of what Keanu was describing. This was no longer just a personal shift in perspective. It was a transformation that reached outward, touching lives Keanu would never meet. He leaned in slightly, voice steady but reverent. "When did you know it was time to speak her name publicly?" Jimmy asked. Keanu did not answer immediately. He looked down for a moment, then back up, eyes clear. "When I realized silence was no longer serving love," he said, "it was protecting me, but it wasn't helping anyone else." He explained that for years he believed privacy was respect, that grief should be quiet, contained, carried alone. But as messages arrived from parents who had lost babies, miscarriages that were never acknowledged, names never spoken, he began to understand the cost of that quiet. "They weren't asking me to fix their pain," he said. They just wanted permission to admit it existed. The AVA Foundation became that permission in action. Keanu described support groups where parents spoke their children's names for the first time, counseling sessions where couples learned how to grieve together instead of separately, research grants that focused not only on prevention but on dignity for families when loss could not be prevented. "We tell them their grief makes sense," he said, "and their love still counts." Jimmy nodded, his expression intent. "You turned something unbearably private into something that helps strangers," he said. Keanu shook his head gently. "I didn't turn it into anything," he replied. "Ava did. I just followed." He spoke about the letters that arrived after the foundation quietly launched, parents writing from hospital rooms, from empty nurseries, from years later still carrying unresolved grief. "They tell me they finally said the name out loud," he said, and somehow that changed everything. The audience listened in complete stillness. This was not inspiration framed as success. It was meaning built from honesty. "I used to think legacy was about work," Keanu said. "Movies, awards, longevity." He paused. "Now I know legacy is about what continues after you speak the truth." Jimmy felt the weight of that statement settle into the room. "So, Ava's legacy," he said softly, "is connection?" Keanu finished. "It's letting people know they're not broken for grieving. That love doesn't expire." He looked out toward the audience, not performing, simply present. "Her story didn't end with silence," he repeated. "It began with it." Jimmy sat quietly, letting the message sink deeper than applause ever could. Around him, faces reflected the same understanding, grief acknowledged, and love affirmed. This was no longer about fame or generosity. It was about continuity, about a child whose brief existence reshaped countless lives. In that still room, Ava's name felt anchored not to loss, but to purpose, that would keep unfolding long after the cameras stopped. It reminded everyone listening that meaning can rise from pain, and that speaking truth aloud can quietly change the direction of many futures for people. When the cameras finally cut to commercial again, the silence did not lift. It moved. It traveled. It slipped off the stage and into the places viewers never see. Behind the lights, behind the curtains, into the quiet corners where people usually hide their emotions so the show can go on. Marcus stood behind camera 3, his hands shaking. He had been in television for over 30 years. He had filmed presidents' disasters, celebrations, and live moments that millions remembered for years. He prided himself on steadiness, on never letting emotion interfere with the frame. But as Keanu spoke about Ava, something inside Marcus broke open in a way he had never expected. His breathing grew uneven, his vision blurred. He stepped back instinctively, lowering the camera just enough for a colleague to notice. Another operator moved in without a word, taking over the shot. No one questioned it. Everyone understood. Marcus turned away, pressing a hand to his face, his shoulders rising and falling as he fought to regain control. 5 years earlier, he had lost his son in a car accident. 22 years old, gone in an instant. Marcus had never spoken about it at work, never once. He believed professionalism meant silence. That pain was something to manage privately after the shift ended. But Keanu's words had found him anyway. "You don't carry the loss, you carry the love." The sentence echoed in his head as he leaned against the wall, eyes closed, tears slipping free without permission. For years, Marcus had carried guilt alongside grief. Guilt for moments he missed, for arguments that never resolved, for surviving when his son did not. He thought silence was strength. He thought talking about it would make it worse. Now, standing in a hallway lit by fluorescent bulbs, he realized he had been wrong. Around him, others were struggling too. A makeup artist sat on a stool near the mirror, hands clasped tightly, mascara streaked down her cheeks. She had lost a pregnancy years ago and had never spoken about it outside her family. A stagehand leaned against a crate, staring at the floor. Jaw clenched, eyes wet. An assistant wiped their face quickly, then stopped, no longer caring who saw. No one told them to get it together, No one rushed them. The usual urgency of production had dissolved into something quieter and more human. People moved slower. Voices stayed low. There was an unspoken understanding that something important had happened and it deserved space. Marcus took a deep breath and straightened his shoulders. He wasn't ready to return to the camera yet. Instead, he did something he had never done before. He walked toward Keanu's dressing room. The hallway felt long, each step heavier than the last. He stopped outside the door, hesitating. His hand hovered near the frame. He didn't know what he planned to say. He only knew he could not keep carrying this alone anymore. He knocked. The door opened slowly. Keanu stood there no longer under lights, no longer framed by cameras. Just a man in a quiet hallway, eyes gentle, posture open. Marcus's voice cracked immediately. "I'm sorry," he said, shaking his head. "I didn't mean to interrupt." Keanu shook his head softly. "You're not," he said. "Come in." Marcus stepped inside the door, closing behind him. The room was simple, quiet, grounded. He stood awkwardly for a moment, hands clenched, eyes down. "I lost my son," Marcus said suddenly, the words spilling out before he could stop them. 5 years ago, car accident." His breath hitched. "I've never been able to talk about it." "Not really." Keanu didn't speak right away. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around Marcus, pulling him into a firm, steady embrace. No rush, no hesitation. "You don't have to carry it alone," Keanu said quietly. Marcus broke. He leaned into the hug, shoulders shaking, years of silence collapsing all at once. He cried the way he hadn't allowed himself to cry since the funeral. Not quietly, not politely, just honestly. Keanu stayed with him, and in that small room far from the cameras, something shifted that would never shift back. When Marcus finally pulled back, his face was red, his eyes swollen, but his breathing had steadied. He wiped his cheeks with the heel of his hand, embarrassed and relieved all at once. "I didn't think I was allowed to fall apart," he admitted quietly. "I thought if I kept working, kept busy, it would stay buried." Keanu met his gaze with calm understanding. "Grief doesn't stay buried," he said. "It waits." Marcus nodded slowly, the truth settling into him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel ashamed of the tears. They felt earned, necessary. Word traveled quickly, not through announcements, but through glances and quiet conversations. As Marcus stepped back into the hallway, a makeup artist approached Keanu next. Her voice shook as she thanked him, explaining through tears that she had lost a pregnancy years ago and had never said the words out loud. A stagehand followed, then an assistant. Each one spoke softly. Each one shared just enough. Keanu listened to all of them with the same patience, the same grounded presence. No one asked for advice. No one needed solutions. What they needed was acknowledgement, permission. "You made it okay to remember," one of them whispered. "You made it okay to talk." Keanu shook his head gently. "You already carried it," he said. "I just helped open the door." Back on set, the crew moved differently now, slower, kinder. People made eye contact and nodded in ways they hadn't before. There was a sense of shared understanding, like a quiet bond had formed between people who had worked side by side for years without ever really knowing each other. Marcus returned to his camera position before the next segment, hands steady again. But something inside him had changed. He wasn't lighter because the pain was gone. He was lighter because he wasn't hiding it anymore. The Tonight Show would go on, another guest would come another night, another laugh track would play. But this moment would stay with them. In the crew, in the hallways, in the quiet spaces between jobs. Keanu's words had done more than fill airtime. They had opened a space people didn't know they were allowed to step into, and once opened, that space could not be closed again. 3 weeks passed, but the night never really left Jimmy. The show moved on, new guests came through the doors, new laughter filled the studio, yet something fundamental had shifted quietly and permanently. Jimmy noticed it in the pauses he allowed now, in the way he listened more carefully, in the moments he chose honesty over momentum. He had not spoken publicly about what the interview meant to him. He didn't need to. It lived with him. It was late when the call came. The house was quiet. Nancy had gone to bed hours earlier. Jimmy sat alone in his home office, the lights dim, a mug of cold coffee, forgotten on the desk. His phone buzzed softly beside him. He glanced at the screen and froze for a moment when he saw the name, Keanu. He answered without hesitation. "Hey, Jimmy," said, keeping his voice low. "Hey," Keanu replied. His tone was calm, familiar now, like someone calling an old friend instead of a fellow public figure. "I hope I didn't wake you." "No," Jimmy said. "I was up." There was a brief pause, not awkward, just human. Then Keanu spoke again. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for that night." Jimmy leaned back in his chair, one hand resting against his chest as he listened. "You don't have to thank me," he replied quietly. That wasn't about the show." "I know," Keanu said. "That's why I'm calling." He told Jimmy about what happened after the episode aired, the letters, the messages, emails arriving from all over the world, parents writing from hospital rooms, from empty homes, from years and decades later. People who had never spoken their child's name aloud before, now writing it in full for the first time. They keep saying the same thing Keanu said, that they finally felt seen, like someone gave them permission to grieve without apology. Jimmy closed his eyes, absorbing the weight of that. That's incredible," he said. "It's overwhelming," Keanu admitted, "in the best and hardest way." He paused. "And it made me realize something. That moment didn't belong to just me, or just you." Jimmy listened, his breathing slow and steady. "I've been working on something," Keanu continued, "the AVA Foundation. We talked about it briefly on the show, but now it's becoming real. Support for families who've lost infants. Counseling, research into stillbirth prevention, real resources." His voice softened. "I couldn't have done this without that conversation." Jimmy swallowed. "Keanu, you helped make this happen," Keanu said simply, "by asking the question, by being present, by letting the silence exist." Jimmy shook his head, though Keanu couldn't see it. "I just listened," he said. "That's exactly it," Keanu replied. "That's what people needed. They talked then not as host and guest, not as actor and comedian, but as fathers, navigating a shared landscape of love and loss. They spoke about nights that felt too quiet, about moments when grief surfaced unexpectedly, about how joy could feel confusing, even disloyal, before slowly becoming part of healing. They talked about Nancy, about how Jimmy had finally spoken openly with her after the show, about how saying the words out loud changed the space between them. Hours passed without either of them noticing. No one mentioned movies. No one mentioned ratings. There was no talk of schedules or publicity, only fatherhood, only purpose. By the time the call ended, something unspoken had settled into place. This was no longer a single shared moment. It was the beginning of something ongoing, a friendship not built on visibility, but on truth. And as Jimmy set his phone down and sat in the quiet again, he realized something clearly. That night on the show had not ended when the cameras turned off. It had only begun. Jimmy remained seated long after the call ended, the phone still warm in his hand. The house was silent again, but it no longer felt empty. Keanu's words lingered not as noise, but as direction. For the first time since the miscarriage, Jimmy felt something shift inside him that he hadn't known how to name before. It wasn't closure, it was connection. The next morning he spoke to Nancy differently, not carefully, not around the edges. He told her about the call, about the letters Keanu described, about the AV Foundation taking shape. Most importantly, he told her what he had never said out loud before, that their child mattered, that the loss still lived in him, that silence had never been protection, only distance. Nancy listened, tears in her eyes, and reached for his hand. She told him she had felt the same way, alone, even together. That conversation did not erase the pain, but it changed its shape. It gave it somewhere to exist. In the weeks that followed, Jimmy stayed in close contact with Keanu. Not constant, not performative, just present. They exchanged messages late at night, short calls, long ones. They spoke about what it meant to move forward without leaving love behind, about how purpose could grow from pain if it was handled with care. Keanu shared updates about the foundation, about families reaching out, about parents attending their first support meetings, speaking names that had lived only in their thoughts for years. Jimmy listened, offering encouragement, asking questions, learning how to be involved without making it about himself. "This isn't about spotlight," Keanu told him during one call. "It's about space." Jimmy understood that now. He used his platform differently. He allowed pauses. He let emotions stay on air longer than usual. He stopped rushing past moments that deserved to breathe. Viewers noticed even if they couldn't explain why the show felt different. The friendship between them grew quietly. It was not built on shared success, but on shared understanding. Two men who had lost children in different ways at different times, finding common ground not in grief itself, but in what grief had taught them. One night, Jimmy sent Keanu a short message. "Thank you for calling. Thank you for trusting me." Keanu replied just as simply, "Thank you for listening." Neither of them knew where this path would lead exactly, but both knew one thing with certainty. That single question on a late-night show had become a turning point, not just for them, but for thousands of people who finally felt less alone. The impact of that night spread faster than anyone expected. Within hours of the episode airing, clips began circulating across the internet, not as entertainment, but as something people shared with intention. Messages appeared with simple captions. "Watch this, listen to this matters." The Tonight Show segment quickly became the most watched of the year, not because it was sensational, but because it was honest. Donations to the AVA Foundation began arriving before the foundation was even formally announced. Small amounts, large ones, anonymous gifts, notes attached to them carried stories heavier than numbers ever could. Parents wrote from hospital rooms where they had just said goodbye. Others wrote decades later, finally finding words for losses they had buried under years of silence. Keanu read as many as he could. Every message carried a name, sometimes just a first name, sometimes a date, sometimes a sentence written through tears. "Thank you for saying her name. Thank you for saying my child mattered. Thank you for letting me talk." Ava's name, once spoken only in private, now moved through thousands of lives. It appeared in letters, comments, and conversations that had never existed before. People who had never told friends or family about miscarriages or stillbirths now found themselves saying the words out loud for the first time. It felt less frightening now, less lonely. Across the country and beyond, families began having conversations they had avoided for years. In kitchens late at night, in parked cars, on quiet walks, husbands and wives who had grieved separately finally spoke together. Parents explained to their other children why there was always a sadness they couldn't name. Grandparents acknowledged losses they had never known how to comfort. The name Ava Reeves became something more than a personal story. It became a symbol, not of tragedy, but of permission. Permission to remember. Permission to grieve without shame. Permission to love openly without fear that the love would be misunderstood. Keanu's decision to speak did not just change his life. It cracked open a space others had been waiting for. Conversations erupted online, not with anger or division, but with vulnerability. Strangers replied to strangers, sharing stories that had never been typed before. "I lost my son at birth. I never told anyone. I lost twins. I still think about them every day. I thought I was weak for not moving on." Something shifted in the collective understanding of grief. It no longer felt like a private failure. It felt like a shared human experience. Jimmy watched it unfold from a distance, humbled by how far the moment had traveled. He read messages from viewers who said they finally talked to their spouses, from parents who said they finally said their child's name without feeling like they were breaking an unspoken rule. He realized then that the question he asked on stage had done far more than guide an interview. It had opened a door. The ripple continued outward. Counselors reported an increase in people seeking support. Support groups saw new faces, tentative at first, then relieved. Medical professionals spoke more openly with families about loss, using language that acknowledged love instead of minimizing it. And at the center of it all was a name that once lived only in silence. Ava Reeves, not as a headline, not as a statistic, but as a reminder that love does not disappear. It changes form, and once spoken aloud, it can travel farther than anyone ever imagines. As the days turned into weeks, the ripple only widened. What began as a single conversation on a late-night stage evolved into a movement shaped not by slogans, but by stories. Schools invited counselors to speak about infant loss. Hospitals adjusted how they spoke to grieving parents, offering space instead of silence. Faith leaders referenced the interview, quietly encouraging families to acknowledge pain instead of hiding it behind strength. The AVA Foundation officially launched 6 months later, and the response was immediate. Thousands of families reached out for support. Some asked for counseling resources. Others simply wanted someone to listen. Many wrote that they had never felt entitled to help before, believing their loss was not enough to justify grief. Ava's name changed that narrative. Keanu stayed largely out of the spotlight around the foundation. He spoke when necessary, but mostly listened. He read letters late at night, sitting quietly with stories that mirrored his own in ways that still surprised him. He answered messages personally when he could, not as a celebrity, as a father. Jimmy continued to support the work quietly, using his platform sparingly but intentionally. He invited experts to speak. He allowed moments of silence on air when conversations grew heavy. Viewers noticed the difference even if they couldn't name it. The show felt more human, more open. Parents began sharing the interview with their children, using it as a way to explain siblings who never came home. Teenagers wrote about finally understanding why their parents carried a sadness they couldn't explain. Older couples spoke of losses from decades earlier, finally allowing themselves to grieve together instead of apart. Ava Reeves became a symbol not of what was lost, but of what endured, of love that had nowhere to go until someone brave enough gave it a voice. Her name appeared on memorial walks, in support groups, on handwritten notes taped inside wallets and journals, not as a reminder of pain alone, but as a reminder that love never needs permission to exist. Keanu reflected on it one evening alone, holding the familiar silver locket. For years, Ava had been his quiet companion. Now she was part of a much larger story, one that continued to unfold in places he would never see, in conversations he would never hear, in hearts opening without fear. The ripple did not belong to him anymore. It belonged to every parent who finally spoke a name out loud, every family who chose honesty over silence, every person who learned that grief shared becomes lighter and love shared becomes stronger. Ava Reeves had lived quietly, but her legacy moved loudly through the world, and it was still moving. The house was quiet in a way Jimmy had learned to recognize. Not the calm quiet of rest, but the stillness that settles late at night when thoughts grow louder. He sat alone in his home office, the desk lamp casting a soft circle of light across old papers, notebooks, and framed photos that told only part of his life story. He opened the bottom drawer slowly. Inside, tucked beneath folders and envelopes he rarely touched, was a folded piece of paper he had not looked at in over a year. An ultrasound, black and white, grainy, easy to dismiss if you didn't know what you were looking at. He had hidden it there on purpose, not out of denial but out of fear. Fear that looking at it would reopen something he had barely managed to contain. He unfolded it carefully and laid it flat on the desk. For a long moment, he just stared. The image felt both distant and immediate. A moment frozen in time that had never been allowed to grow into memory. He thought about how quickly everything had happened. The excitement, the quiet hope, the loss, and then the silence that followed, chosen not because it healed, but because it felt safer than words. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. For the first time since the night of the interview, Jimmy allowed himself to connect the dots fully. He saw how much of himself he had been holding back. How often he had redirected conversations. How many times he had chosen humor when honesty felt too exposed. He picked up the ultrasound again, this time holding it with both hands. It didn't feel fragile anymore. It felt real. Nancy appeared quietly in the doorway. She had learned to recognize when Jimmy was somewhere else emotionally. She didn't speak right away. She just watched him, then stepped closer. Jimmy looked up at her eyes, full but steady. "I found it," he said softly. She nodded, already knowing what he meant. She sat beside him close enough that their shoulders touched. He handed her the ultrasound without explanation. She took it gently, her fingers brushing his. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Jimmy said the words he had avoided for over a year. "Our child." Nancy inhaled sharply. Her eyes filled instantly. She pressed her lips together, then nodded. "Our child," she repeated. The words felt heavy and light at the same time. Heavy because they acknowledged loss. Light because they acknowledged love. There was no rush now to move past it. No need to minimize or reframe. It simply existed between them, finally spoken. Jimmy stood and walked to the bookshelf across the room. He pulled down a simple frame, clean and unassuming. He placed the ultrasound inside, adjusted it carefully, then set it back on the shelf among photos of family and friends. It belonged there. That night, after Nancy had gone to bed, Jimmy sat back down at his desk. He opened his phone and stared at the blank screen for a long time. He didn't think about audience size or reaction. He thought about the people who had written to him, the messages he had read quietly, the silence he had carried for too long. He began to type, not as a host, not as a performer, as a father. The words came slowly at first. Jimmy erased entire sentences, then typed them again, simpler this time. He didn't want polish. He didn't want distance. He wanted honesty that felt close enough to touch. He wrote about silence, about how easy it is to believe that staying quiet protects the people we love, about how grief doesn't disappear just because we stop naming it. He wrote about the ultrasound that had lived in a drawer for over a year, unseen but never forgotten. Then he wrote the words that had finally found their place in him. To anyone carrying pain in silence, you're not alone. Your child mattered. Your love matters. He paused there, his hands resting on the desk, breathing slowly. The message wasn't long. It didn't need to be. It wasn't meant to explain everything. It was meant to open a door. Before posting, he hesitated for just a second, not out of fear of judgment, but out of respect for the weight of what he was sharing. Then he thought of Keanu sitting across from him, speaking Ava's name with calm certainty. He thought of the letters, of the families who had finally found words because someone else had gone first. Jimmy tapped post. The response came quietly at first, a few messages, then more. Parents thanking him for saying what they couldn't. People sharing names they had never typed before, short notes, long stories, messages that didn't ask for replies, only acknowledgement. Jimmy read them all. Some came from people who had never told anyone, others from couples who said they finally talked that night, some from grandparents who had carried grief since a time when silence was expected and language was scarce. Each message carried the same undercurrent: relief. He set his phone down and leaned back in his chair, eyes closing briefly. The room felt different now, not lighter because the pain was gone, but steadier because it had been allowed to exist. On the bookshelf across the room, the framed ultrasound caught the light. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like recognition. Jimmy stood, walked over, and adjusted the frame slightly so it faced outward. He didn't need to look at it every day. He just needed to know it no longer lived in hiding. Later, lying beside Nancy in the quiet of their bedroom, he reached for her hand. She squeezed it back without a word. They didn't need to explain what had changed. They both felt it. Ava had changed him. Not directly, not loudly, but through the courage of another father who had spoken love into the world after years of silence. Jimmy finally understood that healing does not mean forgetting. It means remembering without fear. And that night, for the first time, he slept without carrying the weight alone. Weeks later, the noise had settled, but the meaning had not faded. Keanu sat for a quiet follow-up interview in a small, understated room. No audience, no band, no bright lights pushing energy forward, just a conversation shaped by reflection instead of urgency. He wore the same calm presence he had carried since that night, grounded and unguarded. When asked how he felt watching the response unfold, he did not rush to answer. He looked down briefly, then back up his expression, thoughtful rather than overwhelmed. Every time someone says their child's name out loud because of Ava, he said slowly, her love multiplies. The interviewer nodded, listening closely. For a long time, I thought love was something that ended when someone was gone. Keanu continued, or at least something that had to stay private. But what I've learned is that love wants to move. It wants to be shared, and when it is, it doesn't get smaller. It grows. He spoke about the messages that still arrived daily. Parents telling him they finally visited a grave they had avoided for years. Couples saying their homes felt different now that grief was allowed to exist openly. People writing just one sentence, I said the name today. Keanu absorbed those stories with quiet humility. I don't see Ava as something I lost anymore, he said. I see her as someone who taught me. The interviewer asked him what he meant by that. She taught me that presence matters more than time, Keanu replied. That legacy isn't built in years. It's built in love. He explained how society often measures value by duration, how long someone lived, how many milestones they reached. But Ava challenged that idea completely. She didn't need years to change me, he said. She changed me instantly, and she's still changing people now. Keanu spoke about moments when he felt Ava most clearly, not in sadness, but in clarity. In the pause before responding to someone who was struggling. In choosing patience over distraction. In saying yes to things that mattered and no to things that didn't. She made me pay attention, he said, to people, to moments, to the fact that being present is one of the greatest forms of love. The interviewer asked if he still felt pain. Keanu nodded gently. Of course, he said, pain doesn't disappear, but it doesn't dominate either. He paused. Love is louder now. He reflected on how different his understanding of fatherhood had become. I never got to hold her, he said, but I hold her values every day. That's what being her father looks like now. As he spoke, there was no bitterness in his voice, no sense of injustice, only gratitude shaped by loss. She may never have taken a breath, Keanu said, a small, gentle smile forming, but she gave me life. The words were not delivered for impact. They were simply true. And in that quiet room, it was clear that Ava's story was no longer defined by what was missing. It was defined by what continued. By love that had learned how to move through the world, touching lives far beyond where it began. Keanu leaned back slightly, hands resting calmly in his lap, as if grounding himself in the truth of what he was saying. The room remained quiet, not out of formality, but out of respect. This was not a conversation meant to be rushed. For a long time, he said, I thought being strong meant carrying everything alone. I thought protecting Ava meant keeping her story private. He paused, eyes soft but steady. What I learned is that love doesn't need protection. It needs expression. He described moments when parents approached him quietly in public spaces, not asking for photos, not asking for autographs, just wanting to say a name, sometimes through tears, sometimes through smiles that carried grief and relief at the same time. They don't say much, Keanu explained. They just say the name, and I can see what it does for them. He smiled gently again, not with happiness alone, but with understanding. That's Ava working through the world. The interviewer asked if he ever worried about reopening old wounds by speaking so openly. Keanu shook his head. Silence kept the wound sealed, he said. Speaking lets it breathe. Healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means integrating. He talked about how the foundation continued to grow, not in size alone, but in intention. Support groups that felt less like therapy and more like shared space. Research teams driven not by statistics, but by compassion. Volunteers who had experienced loss themselves now guiding others through the early disorienting days of grief. All of it, Keanu said, comes back to the same truth. Love doesn't expire. He looked down for a moment, then back up. People ask me if I ever wish things were different, he said. Of course I do. But wishing doesn't change what is. What changes things is how we choose to live with what we're given. Ava, he explained, had become his compass, not pointing backward but forward. She taught me to be present, he said, to listen without fixing, to show up without needing to be seen. The interviewer asked what he hoped people would take away from the story, months or years from now. Keanu answered without hesitation, that their love is valid, he said, that their grief doesn't make them weak, and that saying a name out loud can be an act of courage. He paused, then added softly, we don't honor the people we love by disappearing. We honor them by living fully. As the interview came to a close, Keanu was asked one final question. If he could say something directly to Ava now, what would it be? He didn't close his eyes. He didn't bow his head. He simply spoke. Thank you, he said, for teaching me what matters. There was no need to add more. Because Ava's lesson had already traveled far beyond that room. It lived in conversations happening quietly around the world, in names being spoken without fear, in love that refused to shrink. Her life had been brief, but her legacy was multiplying, and it still was. The park was quiet in the way only winter knows how to be, the kind of quiet that does not feel empty but held. Bare branches stretched overhead, their outlines soft against the pale sky. A light breeze moved through the trees, gentle and steady, carrying the scent of cold earth and fallen leaves. Keanu walked alone along the narrow path, his steps unhurried. There was no urgency in him now, no weight pulling him forward or back, just presence. He stopped near a small memorial garden tucked away from the main trail, a place designed not to draw attention, but to offer refuge. At the center stood a simple wooden bench. Carved into the backrest was a name, Ava. Keanu stood there for a moment reading it, as he always did. Not because he needed to remember it, but because seeing it in the world still mattered. He reached up instinctively, his fingers brushing the familiar silver locket resting against his chest. The metal felt cool beneath his touch, grounding. He sat down slowly, letting the stillness settle around him. For years, this kind of quiet had frightened him. It had been filled with questions he didn't know how to answer, and memories he wasn't sure how to hold. But now it felt different. Now the quiet felt like space rather than absence. He looked out across the garden. Small plaques, a few flowers placed carefully at their bases, names that once lived only in hearts, now given shape, given voice. Keanu's breathing was slow and even as he spoke, not to an audience, but to anyone who needed to hear the words. If you're watching this, he said calmly, and you're carrying grief, I want you to know something. He paused, allowing the thought to land fully. Love doesn't fade. The wind moved through the trees again, soft and constant, and it doesn't weaken with time. It doesn't disappear because the world moves on. Love finds new ways to shine. He rested his hands on his knees, steady. Your child mattered, he said. Your loved one mattered, even if their life was brief, even if the world never knew their name. His gaze lowered, thoughtful, but not sad. Silence can feel safe, Keanu continued. It can feel like protection, but silence can also become a place where love has nowhere to go. He lifted his head again. Speak their name, he said gently. Say it out loud. Let it exist in the world. The words were simple, intentional, offered without pressure. For a long time, I thought keeping quiet was how I honored my daughter, Keanu said. What I learned is that love doesn't ask us to hide. It asks us to share. He closed his eyes briefly, feeling the breeze against his face, the weight of the locket against his chest. When we speak love aloud, he said, it changes shape. It becomes something that can reach others, something that can heal. He opened his eyes again, looking at the bench, at the name carved into it, steady and permanent. Because love, he said softly when spoken aloud, becomes legacy. The park remained quiet, but it was not silent. It was full of names, full of stories, full of love that had finally found a voice. Keanu stayed seated for a long moment after the words left him. There was no rush to stand, no need to fill the space. The quiet around him felt earned, like the end of a long journey that did not require applause to be complete. He thought about all the names he had read in letters, names written carefully, sometimes shakily, as if the act itself required courage. Names that had waited years to be spoken without fear. He understood now that saying a name is not about reopening wounds. It is about acknowledging that love was real and still is. For anyone who feels unsure, he continued softly, for anyone who wonders if speaking will make the pain worse, hear this. He paused. Pain doesn't grow when love is spoken. It softens. It finds somewhere to rest. The bench beneath him felt solid, real, proof that remembrance did not have to be loud to be permanent. He brushed his thumb once more over the locket, then let his hand fall back to his side. You don't have to share everything, Keanu said. You don't have to explain your grief to anyone. His voice remained calm, steady. But you deserve to let it exist. You deserve to let love be seen. He looked out at the empty path ahead, imagining all the people who might one day sit here reading names that were not their own, but felt familiar anyway. Grief had a way of connecting strangers. Love did too. If there's one thing I've learned, he said, it's that none of us are as alone as we think. He paused again, letting the truth of it settle. We're just waiting for someone to go first. The wind picked up, slightly rustling the branches overhead. Keanu rose from the bench, slowly standing beside it for a moment longer. He placed his hand gently on the engraved name, not as a goodbye, but as a recognition. Then he turned back toward the path. Before leaving the garden, he spoke one final time, directly and openly. If you've ever carried a story in silence that deserved to be heard, he said, this is your invitation. He did not frame it as a demand, only an offering. Share your story in the comments, Keanu continued, or share a name, or share nothing at all if that's where you are. His voice softened further. Just know that your love matters. He took a step forward, then another. And if there's another story you'd like to see, he added, another journey you want to take with me, tell us that too. The path carried him away from the bench, but the meaning remained, because love does not end when a life is brief. It continues when it is spoken. And every time it is shared, it becomes something larger than loss. It becomes legacy.